Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. Natalie Wexler, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Thanks, Stanley. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. As I was saying right before we started, I took tons of notes. I loved your book, The Knowledge Gap. Um, it's part of my kind of effort to get people in the education field on the podcast and talk to them about what I think is, probably the most important issue in America. I don't know of the world, but for as an American, I think there's nothing more important than the future of education. It's not the sexiest topic in the world, but I think it should be more widely discussed than it is now. So, yeah. So your book was great, and I think people definitely should read it if they are interested in education or want to learn more about it. To start off, I wanted to ask you, when did you really realize that the way we were teaching our kids was wrong? And do you think we're teaching our kids in an incorrect way?
Well, it took me quite a while to realize it, and I think it's not. In some ways, it's really obvious, except when you're looking right at it or when you're trapped within it, because it's so pervasive. The things that are wrong, that it's really kind of hard to perceive. I think one of the chapter titles in my book is "The Water They're Swimming In," and for teachers, that's kind of what it is. And then if you rely on, and this is no criticism of teachers, but because they're so immersed in it, they don't see it. So if you rely on them to tell you what the problem is or what's working, they may not be giving you accurate information. So I had been writing about education for a while. I'd been sort of involved in the education reform movement in Washington, D.C., where I live, in a modest way. I was on the board of a charter school, and I totally believed what ed reformers were saying about what was wrong with education, that we need to just focus on getting those test scores up, and we need, and there's some truth to this, we need orderly classrooms and a school culture that allows learning to take place. And I still believe that's true. But the problem is that once they created the order, what they were doing, I came to realize, was not actually making real learning take place. And so, as I said, I was sort of immersed in this and I was writing about it. And what seemed to be the problem, and what I started out to investigate, is what was wrong with high school, because that's where everything seemed to fall apart. I believed that we were making progress at the elementary level, because the scores were going up a little bit, and then slowly but surely, and to some extent at middle school. But then in high school, everything seemed to fall apart. And so I volunteered in a high poverty high school to teach writing, and what I stumbled upon, and what was eventually explained to me, because I didn't figure this out myself, was that the problems that become really apparent in high school don't begin in high school. They really have their roots in the way we teach elementary school, which, I'd been told, and which I believe was the bright spot in the education system. And so it actually took me a while to just understand this, but as I'm sure we'll get into, and that has a lot to do with the way we try to teach reading. So that's how I came to it. And I think, like other people, it was hard for me to understand this, because this is an incredibly pervasive problem. This is like virtually every school in the country is approaching this in a way that is setting kids up, especially kids from less educated families, setting them up for failure in high school and beyond. And yet very few people talk about it, have focused on this at all, or even acknowledge that it's a problem. I thought I knew a lot about education. I'd never heard about this. So I was skeptical at first. It really is like, seriously? But yes, seriously, this is, and as you say, I think education is a huge issue. I mean, we look at education as a means of social mobility, as a means of creating a fairer, more equitable society. And it should be, and it could be, but not the way we've been doing it, and not the way most education reformers have wanted to do it. And so, unfortunately, I think that a lot of people have kind of given up on education as a way of making a fairer, more equitable society. And that is a huge mistake.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So the first thing, what made you think that elementary school was the bright spot?
Well, as I said, first of all, the kids are just really happy to be in school. Like, oh, it's exciting, it's new and exciting, and they feel like big kids. And so they're more engaged.
Mhm.
And it's very easy to look at a group of kids who are, looking at the teacher and are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and thinking, oh, well, they're learning something, but not necessarily. But the other thing was that if you look at test scores, reading, and I'm really, math, it's to some extent, this is true of math, but math is very different. So I'm really just talking about the reading side. And I can talk more about why math is so different. But if you look at the reading scores, especially these like high performing charter schools, like KIPP and places like that, they were making progress in boosting those scores, more in math than in reading, but to some extent in reading at certainly the lower grade levels, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade. And how they were doing that was they were working hard on the skills that they thought those reading tests were assessing. Like, can you find the main idea of this text? Can you make an inference about what this word means? Um, and so it looked like that approach was working. Um, but the reason that approach looks like it's working at lower grade levels is that the texts and the books that kids are being asked to read don't assume a whole lot of sophisticated academic knowledge and vocabulary. So it can look like they're getting better at finding the main idea or whatever. But then when they get to upper grade levels, when they get to high school, and the texts do assume a lot of academic knowledge and vocabulary and knowledge about things like history and science, if they have not acquired that knowledge, it's not going to help them that they've spent a lot of time practicing how to find the main idea, because studies show that it's not a transferable skill, finding the main idea. I can find the main idea about, if the topic is something that I'm familiar with, pretty easily. If you show me a scholarly article about, molecular biology or something I don't know much about, I will not be able to find the main idea very easily. And that is what happens at higher grade levels. We've spent, and partly because of the emphasis on reading tests and the education reform movement, not entirely, but partly, we have spent so much time getting kids to practice those things that we think of as skills, those reading comprehension skills, that especially in schools where test scores are low, we've marginalized or eliminated social studies, science, the arts. And those are actually the subjects. We did this in an effort to boost reading scores, but those subjects that we've eliminated are actually the ones that have the most potential to build kind of academic knowledge and vocabulary that kids need to do well ultimately on reading tests, not just on reading tests, but in school and in life. And the unfairness here is that the kids who come from more highly educated parents are able to pick up that academic knowledge and vocabulary at home. It really starts almost from birth. So they have the advantage, even if they don't get it in school, and they are more likely to get it in school somewhat, but even if they don't, they're getting it from home. But the other kids who rely on school for that are the least likely to get it there. And this becomes apparent at upper grade levels.
You just mentioned the fact that, for upper class kids, it starts at home. Um, is there a way to help lower income people kids from lower income families have the same advantage from an early age before they even go to school to be able to read?
Well, there are definitely things that could help. And there have been efforts to uh, encourage parents certainly to read to their children, from birth, or sometimes I think even before birth. But and also it's not just reading, but also talking, dialogue, not just talking at kids, but having back and forth dialogue, and especially if you're using more sophisticated vocabulary in that dialogue. That certainly can help, but there are some problems, and one is that parents with lower levels of education whose kids are the ones who most need this, they're limited in the amount of time they have, and they themselves, through no fault of their own, are limited in their academic vocabulary and knowledge. So they'll only be able to they can do something, but we really can't rely on them to level the playing field. As schools need to take on that responsibility. That's what they're supposed to be doing, right? Is building kids' academic knowledge and vocabulary. So there's a role for parents, but it's not going to solve the problem. And I'm not saying that even schools can completely level the playing field. I don't know that that's possible. But I am saying that schools can and must do a lot more than they're doing now, if we want to make our society and certainly our education system fairer.
Yeah, I think as I was reading your book, you kept bringing up the fact that, um, and rightfully so, that we're not teaching social studies and science to the degree that we used to, because of the fact that we're so focused on teaching reading comprehension and math and testing and testing. And those are the subjects that get tested while we cut all the other programs, including the arts, including um, whatever extracurricular things they might want to include in schools. Um, but it's weird, and it's oddly paradoxical that then we turn around when these kids are become, go to high school or become adults, go to college, and we're surprised that they can't name the three branches of government. We're surprised when they can't name tell you who the vice president is. And there are like statistics in your books, and I literally I don't have to turn to the page. I highlighted it and said, this is a national emergency. Like, this is it's concerning, because then those same people will go elect future leaders of our country if they go vote, if they know how to go vote, which is, I mean, let's set that aside. But it's appalling to me that all we teach are these like rigid, kids become very rigid, and they know a finite amount. They know how to find maybe the main idea in some passage that they read in elementary school, but that doesn't give you a lot of real life advantage. And again, I'm sorry, I'll let you, I'm gonna get off my I guess high horse, but um I once heard David McCullough, who's a great, American historian, talk about history, and he said essentially what you wrote in the book, that you write in your book that history or social studies are a collection of stories, and kids love stories. But again, you can argue how we teach history could be troubling. We don't teach it as a bunch of story. We teach it as, this happened, that happened, this happened, that happened. But if you never even learn history, we can't even have that conversation about the history curriculum. So whose idea was it to say, let's not teach history?
Oh, well, that's a real can of worms, let me tell you, because I mean, we do try to teach it at the high school level. There's no high school that doesn't try to teach it.
Sure.
It often doesn't stick. And I think that's for two reasons. One is that a lot of kids are coming in without the background knowledge about history that is assumed by the textbooks and the curriculum. And so, it's been said that knowledge is like Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. Well, they don't have the other half of that history Velcro, so it doesn't stick. But also, and this is sort of a wider problem, goes beyond history teaching, but there's a longstanding idea in education orthodoxy that it's not important for kids to learn factual information. Basically, this is the M word, to memorize anything. I mean, that is really considered anathema. And these days you'll hear, oh, they can just Google it. Why should they know, any facts, any dates? You don't want to waste time on that. You want to focus on critical thinking skills. But I mean, this may be a little bit more of an answer than you're banking on, but the cognitive scientists have found that the way our cognitive architecture works, we can't think critically about things that we don't have factual information about. And the more information we have stored in our long-term memory, the more cognitive capacity we have to think critically about that information. So if you're an expert in one field, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to think critically about another field that you don't have expertise in. So we've really been making a mistake to try to sort of teach critical thinking skills or whatever in the abstract without ensuring that kids retain and understand basic information about events and historical figures and all of those things. Specifically with history, though, you could apply this to that prejudice against memorization to almost any branch of learning. But the history specifically, a big part of the problem is going back like 100 years. Educators and those who train teachers have felt that it's not important, or maybe not even a good idea, for kids to learn about history. There have been various justifications over the years, but the most current and sort of really pervasive assumption is kids aren't going to be interested in history. It's too abstract, it's too remote from their own experience. And there's this idea that young kids, and I'm talking like below 4th or 5th grade, are only going to be interested in themselves and the world immediately around them. There's no scientific evidence to back that up, but it is, I have had all sorts of educators assure me that this is the case. But as you say, history can be presented as a series of stories, as I say, because you're quoting me, so I agree with you. But and I sat in this, one of the things I did for the book was to follow some early elementary classrooms through a school year to compare these different approaches. And one of them was using an atypical early elementary curriculum that did go deeply into history. And those kids were fascinated by things, these were second graders. They were fascinated, for example, by learning about the War of 1812, which the average American couldn't explain to you, I bet, if you stopped, somebody in the street. These kids could not only explain what the issues were, I mean, they had already learned about the American Revolution and the colonial period, and so they knew, they understood the issues. They also didn't know who won, so they were on the edge of their seats. They didn't want the teacher to stop reading because they were really worried the Americans were going to lose, right? So there is absolutely no reason to deprive kids of the pleasures of learning history. And in fact, if this is something they want and we're denying it to them because we feel like they won't be interested in it. And instead, if to the extent that kids do get social studies below 5th grade, it's what's called the expanding environments or expanding horizons curriculum, which starts with all about me, because it's going to expand outward, and then we get to my family, then the school, then the neighborhood, and this goes on for years. So it's really mundane stuff, like let's learn about community helpers like firemen. I think kids are actually a lot more interested in learning about Greek myths and ancient Greece, which I saw them get very interested in, and the American Revolution, and all of these things that they really do need to become familiar with.
Yeah. Kind of before reading your book, uh, this was 4 years ago. I interned at I'm not going to name the place, but a company of some kind. It's like a pseudo government organization during a summer, and they hired high school interns, which I thought was pretty cool because I was a college intern and they had high school interns. So these kids were supposedly from like decent schools, but they were also the best and the brightest in those schools. And I sat next to this high school intern on my floor, and we just had a conversation. He was a really nice guy. Um, we were having this conversation, and we were talking about travel. And I was like, "Oh, where would you want to go travel? If you had, we just had one of those, like, it's a small talk kind of conversation." And we reached a point where we started listing off countries, and I was like, "Oh, wouldn't you want to go to like Berlin?" And he didn't know where Berlin was, and I was like, "Okay, well, all right, I'll set that aside. Where would you want to go?" Like, and he couldn't name me, and I laughed it off back then, but now I'm not laughing because this is the best kid in that, one of the best students in that high school. He couldn't name me 3 countries in Europe, probably most countries in Africa, most countries in Asia. He had no idea where anything was. And I go, but and I was at a loss for words. But for years I told the stories like oh, haha, look at these kids these days, right? Even though I'm 24 and I'm like not that far, he's not that far behind me. After reading your book, I was like deeply concerned because I realized it's not really his fault that he
Right.
doesn't know this. He was never taught it.
Yeah, he was never taught it in a way that would stick. And it's, you know, it is particularly, you think that's bad. Imagine what it is like at a high poverty high school, where kids have not had the advantages that this intern may well have had. But I'd say a couple of things. One is, I think it has gotten worse, but it's not that new a problem. I mean, a book came out in 1987 called What Do Our 17-Year-Olds Know? Co-authored by Diane Ravitch, by the way. And the answer was not very much. And they also didn't know very much about history and geography. I also know a woman who's probably, in her 60s or maybe 70s, who said she moved to this country from Uruguay when she was 10 years old or whatever. And the teacher in her, fourth grade classroom asked her what country she was from. She said Uruguay. And the teacher proceeded to then point out to all the kids where that was on a map of the world. And she pointed to Uganda. So, I mean, I could go on, but yes, it is, it's a serious problem. And, you do wonder, I mean, how can people make sense of a newspaper or magazine if they're lacking that much information about the world?
Mhm. And I think that I mean, you can extend that even further. A couple of years ago, when it looked like there might be some kind of armed conflict with North Korea, the New York Times took a poll and asked Americans, like grown adults, to find North Korea on a map, and 70%, above 70%, couldn't find North Korea on a map. So how can you, or oh, we should go to war in Afghanistan, we shouldn't go to war in Afghanistan. That's the least of my concerns. Why would I listen to a bunch of people that can't even find Afghanistan on a map?
Yeah.
I think we have to start at that. Like, you bare minimum, you have to be able to find the place we're going to go invade, you know? But I get a little, I've been a history nerd my whole life, and it's frustrating when people, you can't really blame kids at a young age because, they're still young and there's a chance. But I was exposed to history at home and in school, right? And I remember the feeling, and maybe I'm romanticizing this a little bit, but if you ask my parents, they'll back me up on this. In 4th grade, I was learning about American history, and that was like the period you learn about all the presidents and stuff. And my parents decided to take me on it was like probably our first trip anywhere. We went to Washington, D.C., and we went to the National Mall, and I dragged them around from like 8 a.m. to like 10 p.m. to go see like Jefferson's Memorial, because I was in awe of these people.
Yeah.
And I loved history. It was the stories, the little things you could tell your parents, like, "Oh, did you know? Did you know? Did you know?" And I'm afraid, like, if you're not exposed to it, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually, just reminds me that I heard from somebody I know who has a daughter who's a 6th grader at a perfectly good school. And this guy is, my friend, is highly educated and knows a lot about history, but he was playing some trivia game with his daughter, and she knew stuff about like Greek myths and everything. But when the questions were about US history, she didn't know what year the United States got its independence.
Mhm.
She didn't know what president was called the Great Emancipator. Um, so, yeah, I think you were very lucky. And I think that parents can do a lot, but even, highly educated, conscientious parents, if the kids are really not learning anything in school, that's a tremendous burden on them too, that they should not have to shoulder
Right.
to teach their kids all about history.
Yeah, and the thing is, my parents couldn't teach me American history, right? And my parents are immigrants from the former Soviet Union. Like
Mm.
like my dad loves history as well, and knew European history, so he could tell me a little bit about European history. I learned American history all on my own, and then I
Mm.
would end up teaching it to my. And there's the factor, like I work around kids. Kids love to tell adults things, and they love to teach you, and they and it's funny, and it's fun for them.
Yeah,
So I think I did the same thing at like third, fourth grade when I learned about American history. I would teach my parents American history.
yeah.
You
And
know,
the second grade class I followed that was learning a lot about American history were mostly from non-English speaking parents, for immigrants from other countries. Actually, about half of them were from families from Ethiopia. And they were explaining things to their parents too. I mean, I talked to some that were Spanish speaking with an interpreter, and they were thrilled that their kids were coming home and teaching them about things. That's true even for American born parents. I think we all love to see our kids exceeding what we could do, and I have heard that, for example, from the head of the Baltimore City Public Schools, which is there are some districts now that are doing things differently. I do want to stress. And Baltimore City Public Schools is one that has adopted a curriculum that builds kids' knowledge. It's not as heavy on history as the one that I'm speaking about, but there's stuff in there and it's definitely building their academic knowledge and vocabulary. And the school population of Baltimore is heavily Black and low income, and those parents are thrilled too that their kids are coming home with all this information.
right? Um, Kind of we were talking around this, but I think for when I first got interested in the topic of education, the conversation in my head that I was having in my head was trying to figure out, was I for public education or for charter schools or all of these different things like voucher programs. Am I for this? Am I against it? And I think early on I was against everything but public schools, because I went to public schools my whole life. I'm like, I turned out fine, and then I kind of realized that there are some problems fundamentally in some public schools, and a lot of public school districts. Uh, I don't like to blame them very much, but sometimes the teachers' unions got in the way of a lot of reform or different ideas. And then charter schools come about, and initially my thought is that charter schools are a good idea because it allows a it's kind of experimentation. It allows people to try different models of education, maybe teach, I don't know, coding in a charter school because it's more specialized towards tech, or um I don't know, something outside the box. But then I realized that even the charter schools fell into the same trap that the public schools were in, where they all taught the same thing. And
Yeah.
maybe and then it became, in my eyes, I might be completely wrong on this, a money making machine for some people. Like you start these huge chains of charter schools, and people, they make good money if they're in charge of these So I'm not saying all of them. I'm saying there are some, very prominent ones, and maybe they lost their direction a little bit. I don't know, but the whole point was to try something different, and then you end up getting pigeonholed into the same thing that everyone else is doing.
Well, I'll say, yes, there are two basic theories about how charter schools can make education better. And one of them is that they're laboratories for experimentation, which theoretically they could be. And as you're right that they haven't really fulfilled that promise, but they still could. And there are, like, the second grade class I keep talking about was in a charter school that adopted one of these knowledge building curricula. And it is, there's less sort of bureaucracy, there's more flexibility and freedom to try something new. Unfortunately, too few charter schools have done that, but it could change. The other theory about how charter schools are going to, improve education is a sort of free market idea that parents will vote with their feet. And ideally, under this perspective, all schools will be charter schools. And so, and the ones that are better will naturally just draw more families, more students, and the others will wither away. That, I think, is not going to save us. It's just incredibly confusing for parents, even educated, sophisticated parents with time on their hands. I live in Washington, D.C., where almost 50% of the kids are in charter schools. And it is incredibly confusing to figure out which one is going to be right for your kid, which one's really better. Plus, if you've got transportation issues, or, there are all sorts of pressures on parents, especially parents with fewer resources, that are going to prevent them from, first of all, identifying what's the best school, and secondly, getting their kid in there, especially because some of these charter schools now have long waiting lists. And then when schools close down because their test scores aren't high enough or whatever, it's tremendously disruptive for the families and the kids who are in those schools. So I don't think that, and I will say here that one thing that could help with both of these theories of, how charter schools can make education better, is if there was easily accessible information about what these schools are teaching, what curricula they are using. It's virtually impossible to find that out, even about traditional public schools. In DC, they've tried to make it really easy. There are these ratings and there are these reports about what school, but they don't tell you what they're teaching. They don't tell you what the curriculum is. And most of, whether it's charter school or traditional public school, most of them are using this standard approach to reading comprehension that focuses on, these skills and strategies like finding the main idea, rather than actually using a curriculum that builds kids' knowledge. I don't want to omit to mention here that there are other things that are hugely important, like just teaching kids to decipher words. And most of the schools in this country, this is getting better, but and I do think charter schools have often done a better job of that, but most of the schools in this country are not doing a good job of that. And most of the teacher training institutions are not doing a good job of training teachers to teach either aspect of reading, the decoding, deciphering the words, or understanding what they mean. So, it's just such a complex problem. I think the idea that charter schools were just automatically going to make things better is a little naive.
Yeah. Um, you you brought up. I was introduced to most of these issues, and I think the first serious book I sat down to read about education policy was by Diane Ravitch, and I read two of her, I guess, her famous books. Reign of Error was one, and then the other one's I think it's The Death and Life of a Great American School or something like that. Um, and I got to a chapter in your book where you seem to, push back against Diane Ravitch, and I don't even want to say push back. I think you think that she's so. Let me rewind. Um, Diane Ravitch focuses a lot on why kids are not succeeding, and why kids are not succeeding. And this is Ravitch's argument is, yes, you could blame public schools. Yes, you could blame teachers unions, all this stuff, but underlying all those issues is poverty, the fact that kids are coming to school hungry sometimes, and essentially poor kids are so disadvantaged. But you argued, and I hope I'm not mistaking your argument, but you said that she does not take into account the curriculum reform that you brought up in your book, teaching more content based rather than teaching is it knowledge based? I don't know the other one. I always forget the name of the other.
Well, I'd say I like to refer to the kind of curriculum I'm advocating for as a knowledge building curriculum.
Knowledge building.
And the standard curricula are more focused on comprehension skills and
Right.
strategies. That's how they're organized. So, well, Diane Ravitch is a very interesting case. I don't know, were you finished with your
No,
questions?
yeah.
I mean, I don't know her. I had a very limited interaction with her while I was working on the book. Uh, and she basically said that poverty is really more the problem than anything that schools can do. Now, what's really interesting is that she didn't used to feel that way. She actually was a huge advocate of curriculum reform. And so long before I wrote about these issues, a man named E.D. Hirsch Jr. wrote a book called Cultural Literacy that came out in 1987. It made many of the same arguments that I'm making. And things have only gotten worse since then, but he was saying, the reason that poor kids are doing so much worse, a huge reason, is that schools are not building their knowledge beginning at the elementary grade. Diane Ravitch encouraged him to write that book, he told me. And something happened, right? I don't really know what it is, but she became, she did go to work. She'd been a liberal Democrat, and she went to work in the Bush administration, Bush 2, working on what became No Child Left Behind, essentially, and became very disillusioned with what No Child Left Behind accomplished or didn't accomplish. And No Child Left Behind, of course, really made tests, reading and math tests, supremely important, the yardstick by which we measure all educational progress. And that had the effect of really distorting the education system so that it focused more on reading and math and less on all these other things. But what she seemed to have taken away from that failure of No Child Left Behind and also charter schools that came along was that education reform just is not going to work. It hasn't worked. And there are other people who feel this way. But it is particularly puzzling in her case because she did seem to understand so well what the problems were. Going back, she actually made her name as an education historian, and I relied heavily on her education history, her critiques of what is known as progressive education orthodoxy, which basically holds that it's not important it's a bad idea for teachers to stand up in front of a classroom and explain stuff. That is at the heart of progressive education orthodoxy. And she was very critical of it, but she's really kind of dropped that critique. And she told me in a very brief email that she just didn't believe that curriculum reform was powerful enough to overcome poverty, essentially. So.
Mhm. Okay, but do you see any truth, or do you think that the point she makes now about poverty and all that is important to kind of acknowledge it before we talk about any curriculum reforms?
Well, I think we need to do everything we possibly can to address poverty and economic inequality in our society. The question is, do we have to wait for that to be addressed before we can start making education better?
Mhm.
And I would say, no, we don't. Would it be easier if we didn't have people suffering from poverty? Would it be easier to educate those children? Yes, because poverty, it's not just that you're not getting access to academic knowledge and vocabulary. It's also very stressful to live in poverty. It creates it can create traumas that make it harder for you to learn, harder for you to behave in school and sit still, all of those things. It would be great if we could eliminate poverty. But good luck with that. We've been trying to do that for a long time. And I would say that what's more likely is if we could, even within the existing constraints of a society that has a fair amount of, a lot of economic inequality, if we could make education better, which I believe we can, that would help us solve the problem of poverty. because if you equip kids with a decent education, they're going to be in a much better position to get better paying jobs and exercise their responsibilities of citizens of a democracy and bring up their children in ways that increase chances of success for the next generation. So I don't understand this argument that we have to fix poverty. And often people say we also have to fix racism before we can do anything to improve our education system. I just think that's backwards.
Okay. So how do we begin to fix the education system? Like if you're a person approaching this for leave, if you're really interested in going to public policy and making a difference, running for Congress or whatever it might be, and saying, I want to make a difference, I want to improve the quality of American education, how do I do it?
Well, of course, I think it's harder to do that at sort of the political level. I think the main, certainly the federal government has limited direct control over this. It'd be helpful if politicians started talking about this issue of the lack of content in the elementary curriculum. But I think the people who have the most direct ability to do something about it are educators and administrators of education systems, and I think parents can help if they become aware of this by pushing for change. But it's as this whole thing's very complicated. So let's say you're an individual teacher in a school system, in a school that's using this approach that is setting kids up for drilling them on, let's find the main idea, let's practice making inferences, and they're not learning anything about history, et cetera. Well, teachers, for better or for worse, have a fair amount of autonomy within their classrooms. They can close the door and do whatever makes sense to them, which is why it's very important for teachers to understand what does make sense. So instead of following, they may have a textbook, or it may just be create your own curriculum, but organize it by the skill of the week. This week, we're working on comparing and contrasting or determining author's purpose or whatever. Instead of doing that, spend at least 2 or 3 weeks on a particular topic, like, I don't know, the life cycle of insects or the human digestive system or the American Revolution. History is a little more complicated because you have to sort of, for one thing, through no fault of their own, a lot of elementary teachers themselves don't know a lot about history, so they are a little hesitant sometimes. But theoretically, they could do this. So what you do is you read aloud. It's very important to read aloud to kids through elementary school and sometimes beyond, because they can take in a lot more sophisticated vocabulary and concepts through listening than through their own reading. We know this is true with little kids, but it's also true. It's been found that that's true on average through about age 13. So reading aloud is a way of giving all students in the classroom, regardless of their, decoding ability, access to the same information. And then instead of having the discussion center around the skill of the week, okay, this week we're working on making inferences. Who can make an inference? That's just asking kids to jump through additional mental hoops. You ask them a question about the content that requires them to make an inference. That's what works. So it's not that we never want to say, well, can you find the main idea? But that should be subordinated to getting kids to understand and think about the content. It's not just memorizing facts. That's where you start. You have to understand the facts, but then you think about them. So this second grade classroom, for example, I wasn't there this day, but I heard they had been learning about Alexander the Great. And one day the teacher said, so do you think Alexander the Great's ambitious nature was an inspiration to his followers, or was it a flaw? And they had a great discussion about that, but they could only do that because they had learned about Alexander the Great and what he did, and they'd understood that. But I will say there is a limit to what any individual teacher is going to be able to do to really build knowledge effectively, because building knowledge is a gradual cumulative process that really extends not just across one school year, but across grade levels. And it should be done in a systematic way across grade levels. And so what really will work best is a coherent curriculum that extends across grade levels, that is focused on content and is focused on building knowledge. And the good news, and that has to be, an individual teacher does not have control over that or what happens the year before, the year after. So administrators have to step in to adopt that kind of curriculum. And the good news is that there are now maybe 6 or 8 curricula out there that, are readily available, some of them for free even. I mean, you can't just, adopting a curriculum is just going to be the first step, because you also have to help teachers implement it. It's going to be very different from what they're used to. But at least those curricula are out there, and more districts across the country are adopting them. I have to say, it's amazed me that my book came out over 2 years ago, and I am still getting many requests to speak and to do presentations for school districts and organizations all over the country. So there is a lot of interest out there in making this kind of change.
Yeah. What do you think people should teach? Like, what subjects should they teach in schools, or does that not matter as much as um, the curriculum that they teach?
When you say subjects, do you mean the topics?
Yeah,
Like,
like social studies, science. Should there be something additionally taught that is not currently taught?
well, I mean, I don't think I there's a list of things or a list of topics or subjects that need to be taught. I think I think we can all agree that it's important for kids to learn about the history of at least of their own country, and
Yeah.
hopefully some other things as well. And, you can sort of look at, and this is what E.D. Hirsch did back in 1987, look at what is assumed by newspaper, reporters or editors or, lawyers who argue to juries. What's the knowledge and the cultural illusions that are assumed? And you can work back from there. And so the curriculum that was being used by the second grade classroom, that I was following, was developed by E.D. Hirsch's foundation. It's called the Core Knowledge Foundation, and the curriculum is called Core Knowledge Language Arts.
Mhm.
So that's one way to do it. But, I think what's really important is that kids have an opportunity to acquire the kind of vocabulary that's going to enable them to learn more in the future. And so there are now, I mean, I do think, I would say history, geography. I think social studies can be a problem because from its inception, the whole concept of social studies was to de-emphasize history. It wasn't really appropriate for young kids, and I disagree with that. But you want to throw in some economics, whatever, that's fine. And science, is also important. And then I think the arts can also build kids' vocabulary and knowledge of the world, and it's also fun for a lot of kids. But there have been a lot of debates lately that you may be aware of, like, well, whose knowledge? How are we going to cover history? Are we going to give kids this sort of mainstream version of history, or are we going to center the experience of Black and Brown communities, their communities? And I mean, I don't think you have to make a choice between those two things. I think you can do both. But, I don't think we all have to agree on one history curriculum. I think you can cover different topics in different ways. But if kids get the sort of the background knowledge and the vocabulary that will enable them to then learn more, that's what's important. So if they understand, and it's not just memorizing vocabulary words, because a word like medieval, you can't understand that unless you know something about history, right? But
Mhm.
words like that, or dynasty, or whatever, that are going to help kids then acquire whatever information it turns out they need later on. And I use myself as an example. I'm in my 60s. I had an extremely ridiculously Eurocentric education, but I have been able to educate myself about all sorts of aspects of history and the world that I didn't learn in school. And the reason I'm able to do that is not that I learned how to learn, or that I learned how to think like a historian, or all of these things that sometimes schools focus on. It's because I had a lot of information and a lot of vocabulary stored in my long-term memory, and that enabled me to then learn about whatever else I was interested in.
Mhm. Yeah. And you were capable, you learned how to absorb historical information as well. I mean, that's something you mentioned in your book, like the fact that it's not taught in elementary school, and then kids in high school struggle to pick up on basic kind of historical um, s- topics is not, again, it's not their fault. It's because their brain is not used to receiving that kind of information or
Well,
retaining that.
their long-term memory hasn't been able to store that information.
Right. Yeah. And
So,
so yeah, for sure. I think I had a similar kind of thing where we focused a lot on Europe, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and et cetera, et cetera. I just picked up a book just on my own because called the Silk Road by Peter Frankopan. And it's just like literally about Asia and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh, I knew nothing about this, never learned about this. So, you know,
right. And I
but
think, actually there's some reading experts, one I can think of who I won't name, who have really challenged this idea that knowledge has anything to do with reading comprehension. And using this one person I'm thinking of, using himself as an example, that he and his wife are able to pick up a book about explaining physics, and they know nothing about physics, but they're able to learn from this book. Well, of course they are. They both have PhDs. That makes a huge difference. They may not have the knowledge of that specific topic, but once you have a critical mass of general academic knowledge and vocabulary, yes, reading is probably the most efficient way for you to learn about new topics. When you don't have that critical mass, then you're going to be in trouble. And the way to acquire that critical mass is through learning in some depth about specific topics. That's the only way it's going to happen.
um so to begin to wrap up, I ask 2 questions of all my guests at the end of every podcast. I'm going to ask them together and you can answer in whatever order you please. The first one is, what gives you hope for the future? As general or specific as you wish. And the second is, what are 5 books, fiction or nonfiction, that you would just recommend to people?
Wow, the 5 books. I wish you told me about that in advance because it may be hard for me to come up with. But well, I'll start with what gives me hope. And I do have quite a bit of hope because I keep hearing from teachers and administrators who are very excited about making this kind of change, and some who are already several years down the road, and they're seeing the change in their kids. Teachers have told me repeatedly, my kids are doing things I never thought they were capable of doing. We've so vastly underestimated what young kids are capable of if you give them the raw material to work with in
Yeah.
an engaging way. And the other thing that I haven't mentioned that I would like to mention is what we can do about the millions of kids who are already in middle school and high school, right, and did not get a knowledge building curriculum in elementary school. And I want to make it clear that, there is hope for them as well. And I would say the most effective thing to do at that level is to teach them explicitly how to write about what they are learning in a manageable way, beginning at the sentence level. And because it's another thing that we have done a terrible job of is teaching writing. And I'm the co-author of a book called The Writing Revolution that lays out a method of doing that, of teaching writing in that way, that was developed by my co-author, Judith Hochman. It's not my method. I just helped her write the book. So, and that too is becoming, there's a tremendous amount of interest in that method of writing instruction. So both the Knowledge Gap and that book, The Writing Revolution, are doing much better than certainly I ever expected. And that's, very encouraging because it indicates that people are hungry for this kind of information and to make this kind of change. Books. Well, I guess I'm going to focus on books about education because I don't know, that's where my head is at the moment. And there's a lot to choose from. we'll talk about authors, because I can think of some authors who have written about education, and they've each written several books. And one is, there's a woman named Daisy Christodoulou, who is British and who has written not just about, and I've written a little bit about this too, but she has written more broadly about not just how we approach reading and reading comprehension, but teaching in general, and how the way teachers are trained just does not line up with what scientists have found about how learning actually works, what cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists have found. So she's written, one I was just looking at was, I think it's called 7 Myths About Education. And I think that would be a good one to start with. There's also well, he's originally from England, but he lives in Australia now, an educator, teacher named Greg Ashman, who has written, he's getting a PhD essentially in this branch of cognitive science called cognitive load theory, which really explains, the importance of having information in long-term memory and the relationship between that and working memory, which is that aspect of our consciousness where we're taking in new information and trying to make sense of it. So I've learned a lot myself from both of those people, and I go back to their work repeatedly. Between the two of them, they've written 5 books. So I guess maybe I could stop there. I wish, I'm sure there are more that have really helped me. I mean, I should also mention E.D. Hirsch, who started in 1987 with cultural literacy, but has gone on to write, half a dozen, probably more books on, to some extent, the same theme, but different aspects of it. And he's now in his 90s and still going strong. So he's, and to us all, and was remarkably perceptive. This was when he wrote cultural literacy, it was really before all of this cognitive science work had been done that really just backs up everything he was saying about what was wrong with education. So I spent a fair amount of time with him when I was writing the book, and he's a character in the book, and he's an amazing person.
Great. I do want to thank you for coming onto the podcast, sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. No pun intended, but the knowledge gap, I found it extremely. It's very readable. I think a lot of people can get intimidated by books about technical subjects, and I assure you that there are some more technical things in the book, but for the most part, it's a very readable and accessible book. So I definitely highly recommend it. So thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Well, thank you, Stanley, for the kind words and for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, my pleasure.